Welcome. It's so wonderful to be with you, all of you Catholic educators and teachers and administrators. Right now, I'm just going to pretend like I'm in a large room, and a lot of you have come to this session because you want to hear, and because you are actually my favorite group of people to be with, our educators. And I'm so happy that we are actually invited to present to you all today, Dr. Karen Villa and myself. And just to give you a little background, my name is Sister John Dominic. I'm a Dominican Sister of Mary, Mother of the Eucharist. I've been involved with Catholic education now for, over 30 years.
Yes.
And love every bit of it.
Excellent.
I was a principal for over 20, and I was blessed to have your son and daughter in the school at the time. And one of the other privileges I've done being a part of the community was really developing Disciple of Christ education and virtue, which really, being a Dominican, it's kind of natural, and it flows into kind of what's evolved out of our discussions together. So the topic of our talk is the synergy of interpersonal neurobiology and the virtuous life. So let me see if you can guess who's going to be talking to you about interpersonal neurobiology. Dr. Villa.
Yes, thank you, Sister. So I'm a trained clinical neuropsychologist. I was trained in the decade of the brain, which was the 1990s, this period of time where we had all these new kind of neurodiagnostic tests where we had ways of looking in on the brain, and that met with all these resources. So we could do a lot of research during that time. And out of that meeting of these resources and these tools, we found all of these new neuroscientific findings. And one of the fields that emerged that I aspire to is called interpersonal neurobiology. So after I graduated is when I had my children, and I met you when I was in the laboratory of raising my children. And their education was a big part of that. So I tried to find ways that what I knew about interpersonal neurobiology fit with the environment that they were going to be doing their learning in. And that's how I got to you.
Yeah, so this is God's providence, I believe. And I think what we're going to be able to offer to you all, which I hope you can go away with something inspiring, something fresh thought, a new look at things, is her experience as a counselor, a mom, studying this, my experience in Catholic education and trying to understand and unpack the virtuous life. But I think before we, kind of dive into where this topic fits is really social emotional learning, I want to take us up 30,000 feet and back 50 years.
Okay. Don't get disoriented.
I know, exactly. So, all right, if you all can imagine, the bells of St. Mary. Okay,
Yes.
So during the time of the bells of St. Mary, that's kind of like the microcosm of where we were in the 1960s in Catholic education. There were about 14,000 schools, Catholic schools, 6.5 million students. But the interesting fact in here is that there are 96% religious men and women and 4% laity working in the Catholic schools. Now, why is that significant to social emotional learning, in particular to our understanding of virtue? Well, what the men and women religious brought to Catholic schools was something which I would say is almost like second nature, ontological. They brought their charism of their community, the formation that they received. This kind of imbibed the Catholic culture of the school. The idea of virtue, of a disciplined life, of a prayer life. And really without even thinking about it, it just kind of built up the school. And it set the tone, the climate in a certain sense. In fact, in this book that I love from the 1965, which is about Catholic elementary school principles, they talk about principles for principles. And these are, the dignity of the child. That's what we focus on today. Children are persons, built-in habits, virtue, that were born for infinite truth, that the child's nature is good, and that practical learning requires a doing. So this was really fundamental, foundational, what every principal would bring any leader in that community. So when we think about, virtue and character growth at that time, they'd looked at things such as courtesy, order, respect, responsibility. But what happened is that shortly after, we've got this time period from the late 60s up until the probably 1980s, is that the presence of the priest in the religious and Catholic schools began to diminish. Now, I don't want to make a judgment on this, because those communities were responding to the requests of the Second Vatican Council. The Holy See was asking them to look at their charisms. So many of the communities stayed committed to Catholic education. Some of them took up other forms of apostolate. That's a totally different conversation. But what happened is that we saw, as the priests and the religious left, the lay people began to come in and to take over these positions in the classroom and in leadership. Some places in institutions, they had kind of like a succession plan where they would train leaders to come in and carry on the charism of their school. But in many places, it over time, it decreased and it diminished. So we see a widening gap of this natural understanding of what virtue is, became further and further and further away as it wasn't taught, as it really wasn't a part of the culture of the school. And also the other thing would be, too, is that many people would feel like, well, that's really something that needs to take place at the home. So we find, if we kind of move ahead a little bit further now, and we look now to 2018, where we have 6,000 schools, 1.7 million students in them, but 97% laity and less than 3% of religious men and women. What happened here, again, was a little bit of a crisis. There was an identity crisis in Catholic schools. And thankfully, as that was happening, thankfully, we've had many leaders that are stepping up, and the bishops are coming forward, that we take a closer look at Catholic identity. So this happened in Catholic schools, and then in society, there was a shift from what I would call a Catholic Christian worldview, where the families were intact. We've seen now where there's more of a fragmentation, there's a disconnection within families. That there's this separation where, going to church on Sunday isn't necessarily a part of every person's normal daily life. And that also has influenced, all that we're trying to do. And the mission statements that many of us spend time writing, were focused on the intellectual, the spiritual, and the physical dimension of the child. And this understanding of virtue, as I mentioned, decreased. So what we had to do, what I had to do, quite frankly, is I had to begin to look at my own mission statement as I saw this impact of this fragmentation, this disconnection, this loss of a Christian worldview in society. And I had to intentionally add a fourth part of my mission statement. There's the intellectual, the spiritual, the physical, but also the social. And I say that this education in virtue is really, more than a curriculum. It's a way of life. We want to make it a part of how we interact with one another. The science that's come out of this decade of the brain sheds a different light in a certain sense, on the importance of virtue education, because they use the idea of, especially in this book, the yes brain, which we will be unpacking in our conversation with one another. So I'd like Dr. Villa, just to spend some time now helping us understand this beautiful science that has come out of this time, and that the underlying development that we see in interpersonal neurobiology, and kind of raise this conversation to another level, that, as I mentioned, that science and faith do come together.
So we're about 21 years out now from the decade of the brain and all of these findings. And we know with any paradigm shift in science, it can take 17 or more years to have it show up kind of in the culture. And the fact that interpersonal neurobiology is showing up on the scene now in the midst of this pandemic, I don't think is a mistake. So with the pandemic and all this virtual learning, we are getting this in vivo experiment about what it's like to take the social emotional piece out of learning. Right. And, anecdotally, we're seeing all kinds of problems with that, if we look around. But it is going to take another 10 or 15 years before we fully understand the impact of removing that social emotional environment. So interpersonal neurobiology was this confluence of sciences that came out of the decade of the brain that showed that the brain is really wiring itself in the midst of attachment, in the midst of relationships, and in the midst of the environment that child is growing and learning in. We used to think of the brain as kind of this static organ that it was going to unfold and develop as it was genetically predetermined to do. But now we know that the brain is wiring and rewiring itself across the lifespan.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's so fascinating,
It really is. And it's why it fits with that God created us to be in relationship. He created us to be connected. And this idea that the brain is growing in the context of relationships and environment is just God's plan revealed to us, I think.
Right. So we have interpersonal neurobiology, and then there's another phrase, neuroplasticity.
Right.
Yes.
So interpersonal neurobiology is very much based on that concept of neuroplasticity. And neuroplasticity is the idea that the brain is wiring and rewiring itself across the lifespan. But we find that this capacity is greatest in childhood and in adolescence. So one of the sayings that reflects that is that experience is the architect of the mind. So the social emotional environment that is getting created in the school system is really wiring a child's neurocircuitry. And we know that neurocircuitry can be wired for good or it can be wired for not good. So it behooves us to be very conscientious about what we're doing in schools and at home as parents, and we talk about that in other forums, but we should be more conscientious about what we're doing to promote and optimize a child's brain development. So I have a deep respect for teachers, and I also have a deep respect for, how much they are managing and doing every day, under difficult circumstances. So I think it really starts just with kind of a value system that this is what they are helping to support. It's not just teaching the subject that they're teaching. It's an appreciation that learning is going to go on so much better if they value and pay attention to the social and emotional world of a child. So just starting with that as a value system, I think, is very important. But I think here I'd like to talk about the river of integration, because this is a way for teachers to observe children and know, it's kind of a quick way for them to know when a child is leaving that yes brain state, which we're going to talk about in a minute. A yes brain state is when they're open and receptive to their learning. But this concept of the river of integration gives teachers kind of just a heuristic of when a child is entering a no brain state and they're not receptive to their learning anymore. So Dr. Dan Siegel is kind of the father of interpersonal neurobiology, and he's the one who wrote this book on developing and facilitating a yes brain state in your children. And he has this picture of a river of integration. So integration is when they're in their yes brain state. When they go to either one of the banks of that river is when they're in a no brain state. And one bank is rigidity, when they become kind of really shut down and unable to engage or receive information. And then the other bank is chaos. So chaos is when they become pretty disorganized. Anxiety is one. Disruptive behavior in the classroom would be another one. So I think being able to recognize those two indicators of a child having left the river of integration would be a second important tool. So we're going to talk about these 4 cardinal virtues that match these 4 qualities that we want to nurture so kids can have a yes brain state. And the first one is balance, and the second one is resilience. So I think when teachers see children leaving the river of integration, they can use tools that are specifically related to those two. And this is where relationship comes in. Because one of the main tools for reestablishing balance, if a child gets too rigid or too chaotic, is to connect and redirect. So the connect and redirect is where a teacher would talk to a child and say, I see you're struggling right now. It looks like you have something going on. And just, it can be a verbal cue, it can be a nonverbal cue. To let them know that they see that they're struggling, and then develop a plan for that.
Right. So that's the value, and that's really, the beauty of you as Catholic educators, just to realize here the importance of making those connections and taking that time, because it's helping them to redirect their focus, to bring them into this river of integration, which is
receptivity to learning.
Right.
So there is connect and redirect, where a teacher is using their relationship, and it can be ever so briefly, to connect to that student and let them know that they understand that they've gotten dysregulated or rigid, or they're struggling, and what can they do to help them calm down until they're ready to get back to their learning. And sometimes it's helping them to step away, and kind of calm themselves down, and then come back to their work or come back into the classroom. But another important strategy, because we're trying to move affect from body and behavior into thinking, is another strategy called Name It To Tame It. So this is where you really put a label on a feeling that you see happening, or a struggle that you see happening. So it seems like you got distracted, and you might be, upset about something that happened over lunch. So why don't you, go and take a walk until you're ready to come back and re-engage in your learning.
So in reference to Name It and Tame It, as a principal, I created these think sheets for the students. So we had different ones for different age levels. And so especially with the little ones, they just had little emojis so they could kind of circle I felt angry, or I felt unhappy, And then we had something for, maybe 3rd and 4th grade, but and especially also in the junior high. But one of the important things is that they can recognize what they've done, but most especially recognize that maybe how their actions may have impacted another person.
Or how they felt internally.
Exactly. Yes, kind of exactly. So that's when you talk about name it, tame it, you have to be able, you identify it. But I think too, just feeling, understanding your emotions and understanding that, it's okay, So obviously this doesn't, just happen all at once. Everything is developmental. So
it is.
I know there's the part of the brain that seems like to take forever to develop. Could you unpack that a little bit more?
So I'll emphasize again that it is developmental, that interpersonal neurobiology is about trying to lay out this developmental pathway to well-being and mental health, versus a developmental pathway to mental illness in adulthood. And so it goes back to this idea of neuroplasticity, where the brain is wiring itself and it's under major construction. So children are born with what we call their downstairs brain basically intact. So this is a part of their brain that's, has all their survival functions in it. Breathing and fight, flight, and freeze, and kind of their emotional assessment of the world. But the cortex is under major construction throughout childhood. And teachers so often, I'm sure, hear about executive functioning, that this is where the seat of attention and concentration is. This is the seat of where a child develops their output. They make goals. They're planful. They can anticipate things. Well, we really find that the prefrontal cortex is entirely wired outside of the womb. So again, it's undergoing major construction in childhood, and then again, there's a big boost in that growth in adolescence. So the Virtue program and the social emotional surround is really supporting those brain structures and their growth. And we find that the prefrontal cortex is the place where cognition, all this cognition and all this learning and emotion come together to create self, to create morality and character, and creates, how a child engages with their environment. And what we're looking for is that they are open to receive information from their learning environment. So that's the river of integration. And they develop this ability to respond calmly and in a reasoned way to their learning environment.
So as I mentioned at the beginning, I know teachers, I love teachers, and you all want something practical. Okay, So the name of this talk is the synergy between interpersonal neurobiology and the virtuous life. So we're going to bring together all the information that she's talked about with the science behind it. Part of what I was saying at the beginning, trying to give you this history of Catholic education and understanding that we've had some bumpy years when we're trying to bring things together. But also the same thing that we all agree about is the most important part is the social emotional learning, the secure environment for their learning and their growing to be able to take place. And the other beautiful thing that Catholic education brings is the importance of relationship. That's why you all have been in school, just going to great things, so that you're not behind the screens, teaching. And then when you've kind of felt that disconnect between your students. So what the understanding of the yes brain, okay, and the words that Dr. Dan Siegel gave, and maybe you could say the words that he used and encourages you to cultivate just from a purely science way, and then I'll kind of bring in with the Catholic language to it.
Okay. So in the yes brain, I do think he's pairing the social emotional environment and secure attachment and relationship along with kind of a cultivating of an internal world that is ordered, and where a child can see that they can use their own mind to modify their own behavior, their reactions, their learning, and focus their attention and concentration. So he uses this acronym, because he likes acronyms, of these 4 skills that need to be fostered, and they match the Cardinal Virtues, and I'll let you talk about that in a minute. But the 4 are balance. So having balance in your emotions. You don't get too overregulated, too upset, or too dysregulated in your behavior. And then there's resilience. This is the BRE acronym. I think I forgot to say that. So the acronym is BRE. The first one is balance. The second one is resilience, that children don't get shut down or overwhelmed in the face of disappointment or mistakes, that they have a way to handle those. And then the last 2 are insight and empathy, and we'll talk more specifically about those in a minute. So
I'm not going to give you a test on this, because sometimes when I'm talking to teachers and I say the Cardinal Virtues, and they're like, oh, please don't ask me what they are, So, okay. So if we take this, obviously, when we talk about the first one, balance, that's the cardinal virtue of temperance.
It is.
The next one is resilience, which would be fortitude.
Absolutely.
And then we have insight, which is prudence. Mm-hmm. And then empathy, which would be justice. So yes. What I find amazing about this, which at the end, is that, how God has kind of hardwired our brains, mm-hmm. coincides with the beauty of the heart, It does. And that he didn't leave us on our own, mm-hmm. Our brains are hardwired to move toward this integration when we are cultivating these in our lives and our
These
relationships.
cardinal virtues.
Exactly, exactly. So what we want to here is to go through, and if we can show you the relationship between both of these will be and offer you some practical suggestions in the classroom, because the more that you do this, you're going to kind of keep your students in this river of integration.
That's right. Their social emotional intelligence is going to benefit because of it.
So let's start with going into a little bit with balance.
So balance is the first of the skills that Dan Siegel and Tina Bryson outline in their Yes Brain book, and how to cultivate that. And they kind of build on one another. So balance is a really basic one. And, I think when we look into the Cardinal Virtues, it's like life hinges on these four. But I would say that's especially true for balance, that we can't do any of the others unless we're able to regulate our emotion, our body, and, keep those in a calm enough state to be open to the world around us. So balance starts really from infancy, that, parents are doing that, and hopefully they deliver children to their school age years in a balanced state. But some children won't arrive with balance, and some children will move in and out of the river of integration and become imbalanced. So, name it to tame it is a useful one there, where you are naming emotions, putting them in a different spot in language, then leaving them in body and behavior, and reflecting on those emotions is helpful. But there's also this idea of regulation, and that's where we can teach children to breathe deeply. We can teach them to have some time in prayer just to calm down their spirit. And calm them down enough to reclaim their attention and concentration.
Yeah, so in all those, so oftentimes I think what's reinforcing here is that that's so important just to the classroom, because oftentimes, I tell the teachers, if we're not taking this time for prayer during the day, or time for Lectio Divina, or time to go to the chapel or the church or whatever it may be, just a quiet time, they may not get that any other time during the day.
Any teacher would say that even one student in the classroom who is out of balance can be, disruptive to the whole class. So, entire classroom strategies that are about, we're just going to sit and have quiet for 5 minutes before we start our learning today. Or, having a specific plan for those one or two students who become so dysregulated that they're blurting out, or they're out of their seat, or they're disruptive. That's an out of balance state that requires that kind of stepping back, helping that student to step back and use their mind to achieve a calm body.
Yeah. So what's important, and with teachers, as we unpack this language for you, so balance, temperance. With temperance, we've got there's virtues like orderliness, there's modesty, humility. These are these virtues that are related to that, and that provides a positive language. We want to always be working on this relationship. So sometimes it's very difficult, with the parent to say, okay, how am I going to call them and tell them that their child is completely out of control in my classroom?
Yeah.
But if you go back and say, let's work on ways that they can be more balanced, or they can be more orderly, or more moderate, or whatever. You're moving them towards. Right, exactly.
It's kind of teaching self-control and
exactly
using this virtue language to teach that a child can be in charge of themselves. And I like to say, when I'm working with kids, the boss of themselves. Right? You don't want your teacher to have to be your boss. You want to be the boss of yourself. And so, fostering that self-control and that temperance is a huge help to them. And when they have that language and they can start thinking about using their own mind to modify their behavior, things just go so much better.
Naturally. So after that, we have
resilience.
Yes.
Yeah, and I think resilience is just so important because we are seeing that children are becoming more and more fragile. and not able to lean into challenges or lean into disappointments and recover from them. So this is the idea that you foster in children, the ability to tolerate mistakes, to tolerate frustration with a sense of optimism and with the idea that they're learning and growing, that they aren't stuck in this fixed state where they feel bad about themselves because they make a mistake and they feel like they can't recover from that and keep trying. So all of learning is kind of effort and skill building. And that's really what resilience is and what Dan Siegel talks about.
Yeah, so that would line up beautifully with fortitude, where we have the virtues of, perseverance, patience through difficult times. I mean, even something like, magnanimity, which is, let's do great things for God or have a larger spirit, But this positive language, it's it redirects them, because you don't want them to become too introspective. You want to again pull them out and we don't want to lose that grit.
That's what it is. It's developing a strength. So this is a teacher fostering, like, well, you didn't get that right the first time, and I know you're going to do better when you try again, and here's a plan for you practicing, whether it's math or practicing, talking to another student about a difficult, relational, social experience. They both kind of require this courage to do that. Well, a child can't do that if they think that they just have failed and they're never going to get it right. So Dr. Siegel and Dr. Bryson talk about these 4 S's that really nurture resilience, and they go back to creating a secure relationship and a secure environment. So they are a child feeling safe in their environment, that they feel seen, and this is so much of the relationship. If we think about one definition of love, it's knowing. So a child feels seen by the adults in their life. They feel known by them. And then the next one would be secure, which is trusting, that they trust their teacher to see the good in them and to nurture the good and to be a resource and a support to them. And then the last one is soothed, which goes back to the balance, right? That a child is soothed in the midst of any imbalance that they're having. So those 4 work really well together so that a child can kind of bounce off that foundation of security to try difficult things, to lean into a challenge, to deal with a disappointment or a mistake.
So these, as you see it, these are hinging together like the 4 cardinal virtues. Right. So our next one is insight.
So the next one is insight, which is the cardinal virtue of prudence. And this is really what we refer to as kind of right judgment. But Dr. Siegel talks about it as a child developing this internal compass. So you can imagine for teachers that balance and resilience are early education. Those are maybe more emphasized. It doesn't mean that you can't emphasize kind of reflective understanding, but it's always amazed me that the age of reason in developmental psychology is 7. And this is also the age as Catholics that we learn reconciliation and this ability to have self-knowledge and be aware. So Dan Siegel talks about this as helping a child to develop their own internal compass of things, where they, understand how to be alone with their own thoughts and feelings, and that they can use their mind again to understand their own mind and make decisions about things and grow internally. And just be more reflective about themselves and the world around them. And certainly when you teach virtue, one of the things that appealed to me so much was that children were taking time out of their day to go to the chapel to pray. They were taking time first thing in the morning to just be quiet with the Lord. And this was really, in my opinion, was really supporting these kind of internal compass skills. And, of course, we want Christ to be part of our children's internal compass. So this focus on virtue, helps them to come into that relationship with Christ and make that part of their internal compass.
And the virtues that, tie with prudence are foresight, planning ahead, circumspection, kind of, looking at the circumstances that are around you, and even docility, which also helps earlier on with the rigidity and just being this flexibility.
Right. Yeah, that's part of integration,
right.
is having flexible responses to the environment. So what this insight piece of things does is help to build a buffer between impulse and action. So we see kids who don't have that buffer. They have an impulse and they just act on it. But when you're taking time out for this intent internal education every day, children are building that buffer between impulse and action. They're having more thoughtful, intentional, flexible responses to the world around them. It's good stuff.
I know, it is. It's exciting. All right.
Yes.
All right, so we got one more for you, and this is empathy.
Empathy, which is the cardinal virtue of justice. Yeah. So I think that these last two amazingly are, how we live out our two main commandments, to love the Lord our God with all our soul. And the second one is to have a good sense of self and other. Right? So you can see insight is really a way that a child comes to develop a sense of self. Yeah. And then empathy is how they're able to take that knowing that comes from developing a sense of self and begin to use that to understand other people in the world. And I would say learn, because they've been with their own internal suffering, they know how to tend to the suffering of another person. Mm-hmm. So empathy, it starts to take on this more active component. Like I bring that caring that I learned about into my relationship with my teacher, with my peer group, and I do things to let them know they're cared about, and that if I see any suffering, that I do things to relieve it.
Yeah, when I talked earlier about the think sheets, one thing we would do is we would have them, if they got into some, situation with a student or there's some sort of misbehavior, how did my action impact the other person?
That's so important, that ability to take perspective. And again, this is building those prefrontal skills that support a healthy mind. So when you're getting to empathy after building balance and resilience and insight, these are the kids who are more mentally healthy, we find, over the long run, and as they navigate into their young adulthood.
So to bring all this together, we're kind of both leave you with some kind of parting thoughts, to kind of make this connection, and that you can really see the beauty of this science and the virtuous life, the heart and the mind together. So what would you like to kind of bring this together for the teachers?
Well, I hope they see it just as a confirmation of what they've already known about being in good relationship with their students and caring about the surround, the context, that it is wiring their students for brain health. And so it's a way that science has just kind of confirmed what we're already doing, but it can turn up the volume on the importance of it and how it's going to lay these foundations of social and emotional intelligence, and it's going to better equip students to benefit from their learning. So we know in academics that it's not just knowledge that teachers are conveying to children. That's an important half of it. But the other half is this character development. And those two working together is what leads to critical thinking. And we would say in interpersonal neurobiology, it's what's going to lead to mental health in the long run.
I know this is a lot of information for you all to take in, and we will conclude a slide with terms, so you can kind of go back and take a look at it. Also some books that you may want for your personal reference. And if you've liked what you listened to in our conversation today, I invite you to check out our podcast at Lumina Ecclesia Digital on YouTube. And we have an ongoing conversation where we kind of go more in depth about this. So thank you for your time and your attention, and hopefully this has been inspiring to you and to help you to become an even more awesome teacher and Catholic leader.